Hello, I'm Richard Colby from the University of Denver. On behalf of Rebecca Schultz Colby, Katie McDonald, Doug Hesse, and myself, I'd like to welcome you to Session U and our video presentation, What Do Undergrads Write and What Do They Value? Findings and Implications of Two Current Studies. We are sorry that we could not be available to answer questions live, but we all share our email addresses during the course of the video, and we would be happy to answer questions about anything we discuss here. We will start by sharing our replication of the Meaningful Writing Project and end with Doug Hesse's Vertical Longitudinal Study. Today, Rebecca Schultz Colby and I will be presenting on a version of the Meaningful Writing Project that we conducted at the University of Denver in 2019. Eodice, Gere, and Lerner's 2017 published study, The Meaningful Writing Project, found the following. Students shared that meaningful writing projects offer students opportunities for agency, for engagement with instructors, peers, and materials, and for learning that connects to previous experiences and passions and to future aspirations and identities. One of the peculiar findings about this original study was that they claimed the results were not generalizable. To clarify, they argued that the concept of having a meaningful writing project extended from undergraduate to graduate students, and that it was a shared phenomenon, and that we should share our stories, but that the study findings were not meant to be generalizable across diverse universities and student populations. The humanities tend to bristle at the word generalizable. That said, the study itself does offer possibilities as a model study to be replicated. I thought a similar project might prove interesting for the University of Denver. In fall 2019, I collaborated with a writing minor, Katie McDonald, and a colleague, Rebecca Schultz Colby, to conduct a small-scale replication of this meaningful writing project study. This video presentation features Rebecca and me, but Katie's work on the study is also reflected here. In our study replication, we made two changes. In the Eodice, Gere, and Lerner study, they also surveyed and interviewed faculty, which we had neither time nor resources to do. Second, we added an important question absent from the original study. We wanted to know what students considered their least meaningful writing project. While Eodice, Gere, and Lerner discuss how inspiring it was to hear about meaningful writing projects, we knew from our previous longitudinal study that an assignment enjoyed by one isn't enjoyed by all. While finding meaning and finding joy are different, there were no instances in Eodice, Gere, and Lerner, nor in our own study in which a participant reported disliking a project that they also found meaningful. In one 10-week term, we ended up with 161 usable survey responses across all class levels and 12 interviews. We compiled and coded the qualitative data using the previous study's findings as an a priori coding scheme and then determined some emergent codes. We found similar, but not precisely the same patterns. Rebecca will discuss our 12 interviews to describe this nuance. After compiling and analyzing the data, we identified the most common qualities of a meaningful writing experience as personal connection, level of autonomy, engagement, and relevancy. This finding is almost verbatim what Eodice, Gere, and Lerner found. When asked about their least meaningful writing project, almost half of the students indicated that they found summaries, response writing, reflections, and other writing to learn assignments their least meaningful. One student summed this up by answering, quote, I really do not like writing an analysis or reflection on a piece I read for class. It is most students' opinion that those assignments are more like busy work. People do not enjoy this, end quote. Next, almost 30% named specific academic genres, including lab reports and research reports, as least meaningful. This was followed by writing on topics students did not find interesting, with 22% finding them least meaningful, including responses such as, quote, writing about food, or, quote, all my marketing papers, or, quote, anything about Puritans. Overall, our modest study mostly aligned with Eodice, Gere, and Lerner's findings, whereas they found that 79% had not written a project like that before. Our university, that was 60%. They found that 29% of their most meaningful writing projects came from general education courses. At our university, that number was 40%. Now I'd like to turn this over to Rebecca Schultz Colby. She's going to talk into more depth about the interviews that we conducted.
Hi, this is Rebecca Schultz Colby from the University of Denver, and I'm going to be presenting on the University of Denver Meaningful Writing Project, what writing projects students found most and least meaningful. To get a closer look at why students found certain writing projects meaningful, Richard Colby and I conducted 12 interviews with students who also filled out a survey about the writing they found most meaningful. We asked the same interview questions as Michelle Eodice and Ellen Geller and Neil Lerner, but we also asked questions about what types of writing assignments students found least meaningful and why. To code the interviews, we used the same coding scheme as Eodice, Geller, and Lerner. However, we added our own codes for the least meaningful writing projects. In our study, students feel the writing is meaningful if they have conducted substantial research, with 3/4 of the interview participants finding research to learn meaningful, and one person saying that writing that was not research driven was least meaningful. In fact, 3/4 of the meaningful writing projects involve research. And as a result, almost 2/3 of the interview participants, or 7 students, named a writing project from their first year writing class as most meaningful. However, students want to feel personally connected to this research. Whether this personal connection comes from a sense of agency in choosing a topic they are interested in, or whether it comes from researching a topic they have a personal connection to, which roughly corresponds to Eodice, Geller, and Lerner's finding of almost 2/3. Reinforcing that students need to feel personally invested in their research topics, students found least meaningful writing where they were just supposed to regurgitate research information, telling the teacher the right answer, with 1/3 of interview participants disliking information dumps in the writing. Similarly, half of the interview participants also disliked writing that they felt no personal connection with, often referring to it as busy work because they felt completing the writing was just fulfilling a class requirement. This was the case even if the writing was reflective, which at first seems contradictory as reflection should be writing about personal connections. However, one research participant said he disliked the reflective writing he did in his major because although he knew it was supposed to help him learn disciplinary content, he felt as if he was just fulfilling a class requirement. There also seemed to be a continuum between research writing on one end and reflective and creative writing on the other. For instance, one participant said that she disliked creative writing while she only valued research writing. Conversely, while 2 participants were creative writers who thought their creative pieces were most meaningful, one creative writer said that she disliked research writing, which she referred to as blank, because she felt there was no room for her voice as she was just filling in quotes. However, while 3/4 of the participants thought that their research projects were the most meaningful, many of these writing projects fell in between these two extremes. Participants often enjoyed writing about their research in novel ways, particularly if it pushed them to be creative. For instance, one participant said she disliked creative writing because she didn't feel she was good at it, but then she found an assignment that asked her to put her research in listicle form as meaningful because it helped her engage with her creativity. Well, there were 3 multimodal projects in the interviews. 2 of them were research projects. One was a documentary for an honors course, and another was an illustrated research paper for an anthropology course. Furthermore, 2 of the meaningful research projects used reflection to help students discover research topics that they felt personally connected to. For instance, the student who wrote a documentary researched the connections between adoption and foster care because she was adopted. The other participant disliked reflection if he felt no personal connection to it, but found it meaningful if it helped him to find a personal connection to a topic. 2/3 of interview participants also found research projects meaningful if they were long, even though one participant said that she did not find length meaningful. In fact, one participant indicated that a paper was not meaningful because it was too short at 3 pages. Length meant that students were deeply engaged with the topic and recognized its complexity. For instance, a history major who found her senior capstone meaningful because she was researching the police and court systems on Native American reservations between 1870 and 1900, said that one could spend a whole career as a historian researching it. Of course, a sense of pride and accomplishment goes hand in hand with substantive length, and 2 students felt a sense of pride and accomplishment after substantively researching and writing a paper, particularly because it seemed to allow them to explore a topic in more complex ways. For instance, a student who spent over 10 hours on just the rough draft of an honors research paper said, I think the challenge is kind of what makes it fun and meaningful and rewarding. And so a lot of our counting writing is still challenging, but it's not very fun and it's not very meaningful because it's not my own ideas necessarily. So I don't really have to think super hard. To help students write these long substantive research papers, Papers were often carefully scaffolded into an overall process for students, often with shorter assignments or class activities that were then used to develop the longer paper. And students almost always had feedback from either the teacher, their peers, or both. For instance, all but one student described a writing process much more involved than writing the paper in one sitting the night before, because it was a process that also involved feedback and revision. For instance, even the honor student who binge wrote her paper in one 10-hour sitting indicated that she revised her paper further afterwards after getting feedback from her professor. Even the student who wrote the research listicle discussed careful research, pre-writing, and planning that went into her project in order for her to draft her listicle. Finally, two-thirds of interview participants wanted freedom in their writing for it to be meaningful. However, freedom is a complex term that meant agency to choose topics. Nevertheless, for all but one student, freedom also meant that students were free to research and then write about their chosen topic in a rhetorically purposeful way within a particular genre. As a result, the freedom to purposely write within a genre almost always went hand in hand with the agency to choose a research topic. For instance, one interview participant referred to her research paper as free writing, saying, "This was kind of like the last free write paper that I've done." And by free, I mean it was open ended. Later on in the interview, though, she described the freedom she had in writing the research paper genre as, "Here's a very rigid structure, but you can write about a topic in a way that you find interesting." So, like, that's been helpful. So, interview participants wanted the freedom to write about their chosen topics in ways that they found rhetorically meaningful for their topic. This genre freedom did not mean that there was no genre structure or rhetorical purpose, though. In fact, a third of students found writing in which they received unclear directions and little to no guidance from the professor as unhelpful in teaching them to write, and as a result, non meaningful. So, while the genre had to be flexibly accommodating, it also needed a rhetorical, purposeful structure. For instance, when asked what projects they did not find meaningful, two interview participants discussed writing in which they thought genre conventions were too rigid, and one student disliked genre conventions that they did not rhetorically understand and thus considered merely arbitrary assignment requirements. Our overall findings then indicate that students also valued structured choice. They wanted to feel free to explore a topic of their choice that they felt a personal connection to, usually through research, but they also wanted constructive feedback on how their writing evolved naturally within the social purposes of a particular genre. Meaningful writing projects also existed on a continuum between creative and reflective writing on one end and research papers on the other, with reflective or creative pieces that also used research in the middle.
Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions or you want further information, please feel free to email us at the email addresses at the beginning of this video.
Hi, this is Doug Hesse at the University of Denver. For the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you about a study that I did trying to do a profile of writing during the spring of 2021 among undergraduates at DU. I'm going to share screen a little bit, which will allow me to apologize. According to the conference program, and it was a very fair promise, the title of my talk was going to be a vertical longitudinal study of 100 undergraduate writers. As you can see here, there were many compromises in doing this particular study, enough that what I'm going to report on is in some ways a failed study. So that's fair warning. If you would rather spend your time elsewhere, I completely understand, but this is a difference between what's appeared in your program. The background for this particular research. Several years ago, several colleagues and I undertook a very ambitious longitudinal study of DU undergraduate writers. We contacted over 100 of them through a random sample. We invited them to participate for 4 years in a longitudinal study. We compensated them quite nicely for their participation. And we ended up with about 60 students who completed all of the phases of the study. That study involved a quarterly questionnaire about their attitudes, experiences, the amounts of writing kinds, and so on. We interviewed them in some depth each year, including a very interesting final exit interview. And most tellingly, we had them upload all of the writings that they had done each quarter. That amounted to almost 11,000 different documents, almost 33,000 pages of writing, and almost 10 million words. We coded all of that through various dimensions. We have a rich amount of data there. That proved to be formidable. And if you buy me a cup of coffee sometime, I'll tell you about the problems of that study and why the kinds of big reports that we had imagined just never took place. Although this summer, later on, I want to return to some of this and see what we can do with that data. Obviously, doing a 4-year study involving that many students is really tricky. So I came up with an idea of doing what I would call a vertical longitudinal study. I thought we would randomly select about 100 students, 25 for each undergraduate year. We would do some detailed interviews with them about their writing, and then that would allow us to compare writings from previous years. So for example, the freshmen in the study in 2021, we would compare to the writings of the students in 2008 when they were also first-year students. We were going to do all of this in spring 2020. We all know what happened in spring 2020. The reality of it then was by the time was able to return to this in the spring of 2021, circumstances had changed quite a bit. It proved very difficult to convince students to participate in the study. And it was really the case that doing online interviews just was not going to happen. What I did then was to send an invitation to participate. This is an IRB approved study to 241 students, hoping that I might get 100 or so, hoping that they might be distributed across grade levels. Despite lots of reminders and so on, promises of gift cards to the first 40 participants, only 37 students agreed to participate in the study. As a result, there are not only impossible things to say about writing at each level of current undergraduates. There were overwhelmingly first-year students, about 15 to 17 first-year students in this sample. So you can't compare across levels, and we certainly can't compare with very small numbers in each group to their predecessors of 10 years ago. So those are all of the caveats. What I can share are some impressions. So we asked about the writing that was happening in their courses. Those 37 participants reported on 132 courses that they were taking. 103 of those, or about 78%, required some writing. The kinds of classes that tended not to require writing were things like studio arts classes or music ensembles and so on. There are a few others, but by and large, students wrote in a lot of their classes. They also reported on the number of different assignments they had in each of these courses. I think this number is not quite accurate for reasons I'll explain later. I think it's low. But you'll see that about half the students said that they had 6 or fewer assignments in classes that required writing. About half said they had 7 or more, in some cases many more in their courses. So quite a bit of writing in several classes. Again, in terms of how much writing, about a quarter of the students said, oh, it was 1 to 4 pages total. About 20% said 5 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 24, 12% said 25 or more pages. Again, I suspect this number is low for reasons I'll explain in this next slide. We gave students a very extensive list of types of writing, papers of various lengths, lab reports, reading journals, notes, peer review, and so on. Students invariably said they did lots of different kinds of writing in their courses. So here are three profiles. This first student says, I did 4 kinds of writing in this course: papers of various lengths, essay exams and quizzes, multimedia. Second student says, I also did 4 types of writing, again, short papers, medium papers, but here's a reading journal or notebook, online discussion contributions. And then finally, a student here who said, oh, I did 8 kinds of things in my class, you know, including multimedia, including discussion contributions, and so on. It strikes me, just from the reports to this question, that very few students were doing 1 or 2 writing assignments. I think instead what was happening when you ask students to do how many assignments, report how many assignments they had, they look at papers. And when you ask them about other kinds of writing, it cues them, oh yeah, I did this. An interesting thing, we asked them about confidence in their writing abilities. University of Denver students have perpetually been very confident in their writing abilities, and the students in this sample were no exceptions. You can see that 78% of them considered themselves strong or proficient. Very interestingly, the first-year students were more confident than their upper class colleagues. That's been true from some studies we've done over the years. Students come in pretty cocky and confident, and they get, I guess, disabused a little bit during their sophomore and junior years. No student reported themselves as a struggling writer. And again, that seems accurate to our sense of the student body at DU, which is fairly confident and competent coming in. Just really quickly, this compares interestingly with students from 10 years ago. The last question here, how would you generally characterize your overall writing abilities? You can see that as first-year students in 2007, they thought they were pretty skilled as writers. Here, by the time they were graduating seniors, they really thought highly of their abilities. Again, not without some justification. This tracks interestingly on that. We asked students about how much self-sponsored writing they did. 62% said they do a fair amount. You'll see in this list that journals and journaling were predominantly mentioned. At least 10 or 11 students mentioned doing this. Some of them just, that was the only kind of self-sponsored writing they did. But others did that in concert with things, for example, as making cards or writing cards or notes. There's part of me that's really happy to see these analog forms showing up here. Interestingly, very few students mentioned social media posts. I wonder if this is something, if teased out through interviews, would show up more, or if in fact students are consuming a lot of social media but not producing it. We asked students as well if they were writing as a part of a job or an internship or a club, sorority, fraternity, what have you. 19% said that they were. Interestingly, you know, there were several, and these were more upper class students. Here's somebody who's a legislative intern who's writing fact sheets, newsletters, social media posts. Here's somebody who has a job where they're writing case notes for clients, volunteer freelance work, writing as part of a campus job. Some interesting things there. In terms of the question about the most meaningful writing that students did this quarter, it's all over the board. I think it's impossible to generalize very much from this sample beyond something as high level and perhaps mundane as, did they have agency, and was it producing an artifact that had personal value to them as opposed to value for some organization or as an academic exercise. My colleagues Richard and Rebecca will talk about a much better study they've done about meaningful writing at DU, but just some impressions. The example number one here, discussing propaganda from a history class, this thing that jumps out, I got to be creative with it, which I prefer more than academic formal writing. Again, that sort of agency, fun, personal stake in it came through many times. Several students mentioned doing research, especially primary research. Students in writing classes often cited that. A couple of students mentioned sort of writing to learn things. Here's a weekly journal for Foundations of Communications class. A few students wrote about things that seemed productive for their careers. Meaningful writing in a biology lab taught me what I need for my future in a way that I think would be useful. There were some other ones, again, some research, things they learned. A writing to learn one in number 6 here, a marketing plan, it allowed me to tie concepts together. And then a few things like personal essay on forgiveness, which was a form of therapy. But I don't think it's hard, it's very easy to generalize from that. So just in the interest of time, I have a few final thoughts. I do think the method that I was using is a valuable method. It just needs to be done better and in better circumstances. The idea of taking a particular slice of time, looking at the kinds of writing that random samples of students are doing at various stages in their undergraduate careers, allows you to do some comparative work really quickly. Now, you could do this, I suppose, a version of this every single year for 4 years. Again, looking at first, second, third, and fourth year students, you could do some comparisons across the way. The nice thing about this method is that you don't have to worry as much about people leaving the study, and you will have some findings right away. I have some questions about the effect of the online settings of this. I suspect that students were doing more writing because they were online purely, and that transaction was happening largely in writing. I don't know that to be the case, but that would be an interesting thing further to compare this quarter with some other quarters in more traditional settings. There was a good amount of extra and co-curricular writing, though again, as I said, surprisingly little was reported as social media. I do think there are some interesting things to be understood about what students find meaningful in the framework of a given quarter and their academic classes. There's some more analysis to do there. But I'm going to leave it at that. Again, I apologize for the lack of rigor and delivery on the promise of the original proposal. There's some interesting things. I'm happy to answer questions. If you email me, I'll upload these slides. But I do appreciate your listening and watching, and hope you have a good rest of the conference.